About the book as a whole, Perspectives on Paradata, Research and Practice of Documenting Process Knowledge. And this book kind of came out discussions in the research project called Capturing Paradata for Documenting Data Creation and Use for the Research of the Future, based at Uppsala University. And as a part of the project and an extension of it to engage others, colleagues interested in the Paradata concept to join in the discussion about what we have been doing for the past almost 5 years at the moment. The project as a whole and sort of the book as a part or related to it is interested in the question of the lack of contextual knowledge on the creation and use of research data as a kind of a general issue. And this is underpinning much of the discussion that kind of led to formulation of what the book came to be. And put it in kind of a context, this kind of question of what it's about to know something about data creation, processing, and use, and why it's important, is an observation that's been pretty widespread in different fields of research, that while you can have a data set that's fairly well documented according to all the criteria how data sets should be documented. So if it's only the data itself that's documented and there is a lack of adequate information on how it was created, what was thought about, what decisions were made, what theoretical and practical underpinnings were guiding the data making and then later processing and use of the data. So it can be quite difficult or almost impossible to know how to use the data for any other contexts in close or in the remote future, either by those who created the data and those who are kind of outsiders from the outset. And this is obviously a problem that is difficult or impossible to solve as a whole, but still figuring out how to convey some knowledge about the processes of creation, processing, and use could make a big difference in making datasets more usable in the future. The book itself, started by a round of invitations to people that we knew and we heard that might be interested in Paradata. We invited the whole bunch over to Uppsala for a couple of years ago in the summer of 2022 and had a workshop where we discussed preliminary ideas and drafts for different chapters of the book and talked us through what Paradata could be and what it might not be. Here are one of the editors, Lisa, who's not here with us today, and Megan, who together with Michael. Michael is here with us today. And the book is about really about the question that it's crucial to know what data is all about and where it originates, and what different ways in different disciplines, different fields, different contexts there might be to think about different types of Paradata, different types of availabilities and adequacies of this kind of information about data making and processing. And this is an edited volume with a number of chapters that look into this question from a wide variety of different perspectives. The table of contents looks like this. We do have a number of chapters from different perspectives. The first part and the second part comes here. And as a whole, some ideas that could be said on the book as a whole will go into more questions and in more detail in these questions. But what could be said about the book as a whole? So it seems quite clearly that Paradata can be in many different ways a measure against various types of black boxing of practices of doings. And that has several repercussions in in the contemporary society and context in discussing the whereabouts and origins of data, both in specific contexts and in general in everyday life. So, for instance, and not least, due to the rapid proliferation of different types of AI techniques. It is also a question partly in many contexts about the hope of reproducibility of the practices and processes, how to make it possible to relive things, redo things. Then we have can note from the book that Paradata is definitely something that's very much in plural. There is not one type of Paradata, but many different things can function as Paradata. Moreover, Paradata is something that is very clearly done. It can be documented, it can be generated purposefully, but it can be also done through different types of activities where it kind of comes out as a result, as some kind of a byproduct. And finally, it is also quite apparent that instead of really pushing for the idea that okay, Paradata would be and should be kind of the new concept that will be used and that should prevail all of the previous ones, some of which will be discussed here today. It's really maybe the most productive as a sort of a thinking aid. But thinking with Paradata, thinking in terms of Paradata, can help us to understand data documentation it can help us understand practices and processes. And then there is also the ethical perspective to the whole. So what it means that there is poor and not so poor Paradata, the quality, the goodness, the fit, adequacy, sufficiency of Paradata. Bad Paradata can have bad consequences. What is good Paradata and to what extent different types of Paradata have positive consequences. And then finally come to the question of that Paradata it's really a question, it's a concept that focuses on different types of transparencies. And sometimes, and mostly, they can be positive, but there are also other phases of transparency. Sometimes disclosing everything might not be the best idea. So the final sentence of the whole book, with Paradata we need and want to know how knowledge came into being, is kind of some sort of putting it all together in a sense that with Paradata we can do certain things. We can try to understand where knowledge comes from and how it comes from into being. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge that there are different sides to it. And having said that, so then we can go and do a round of quick plunges into some of the chapters of the book in the order of appearance in the book itself. And that would mean that the first one to say a few words of the chapter would be Patrick. It will be the chapter on survey research. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the introduction. So this is a chapter written together with my co-author, Simone Reuss, who is an archaeologist and statistician and survey scientist. And in our field, the science of surveys, so systematically asking people questions, typically with a questionnaire and recording the answers. Paradata is a term first used in 1999 by Mick Cooper, but sometimes for Paradata were even employed for years or decades before then. So in our field, it's become quite a mature concept. This is one of the reasons why we were very happy to be able to contribute to this book. And connecting this a bit to Isra's introduction, stressing the concept of context. So among survey scientists, sociologists are one of the main groups of scientists interested in capturing the context of the data collection. So it's not surprising that it's sociologists, but not just context for the whole survey, but on the level of the individual data points or the individual respondent, or even the individual response in their survey. And somewhat early on in the process of this book, the writer's workshop was really great because what came out of that for us was a a keen interest of our colleagues in questions such as how exactly does your field define paradata? What's the connection to other types of data, such as metadata? What are the delineations? Are there overlaps? And so on. And this is what we spent the first part of our chapter answering these questions. I think that's the main scientific contributions of our chapter. Again, going back to Issa's introduction, probably the focus on practice and applications in our field of service science is perhaps the reason why these definitional issues had not been addressed conclusively in the literature before. It's probably people say, I know it when I see it, and don't spend too much time thinking about the concepts, but just want to apply them. And yeah, for the rest of the chapter, we sort of take the reader on a grand tour of Paradata and surveys. We don't assume any kind of background knowledge, but we talk about different examples, how Paradata can be structured and designed, what are possibly applications, challenges, and so on. And for these very many topics that we touch on, we try to give like the single best reference we could find, typically one that for this niche also has a good literature review. And this was, yeah, a lot of time trying to find the best single reference we could give the reader. So that's it from our side. Thank you very much. We're really glad that we could contribute.
Thank you, and thank you for your contribution. The next one to go will be Sarah Buchanan, who wrote a chapter together with her colleague Theresa Huntsman, who does things with Paradata as pedagogical support for archaeological field school sites. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Isto. And thanks, everybody. And especially we want to thank the CAPTURE team for organizing us. So it's a pleasure. I'll share a little bit about Chapter 5. Theresa Huntsman co-authored with me, then of Yale University and now of Seattle Art Museum. And in our chapter, we offer a new kind of narrative, a dusting, which consists of two parts, a description of data practices on an archaeological site and an explication of the key pedagogical outcome that archiving such paradata makes possible. We illustrate the dusting in 4 separate analyses, each based on work we conducted in the role of data archivist. First is Sardis in Turkey, then is Morgantina in Sicily, Italy, then is Poggio Civitate near Siena, Italy, and fourth is the Venus Sanctuary in Pompeii, Italy. Archaeological field schools took place at each of these sites over a number of years, and field schools comprise a unique blend of archaeological research and archaeological pedagogy, involving students on various teams working with staff and local experts over a number of weeks. Rather than further describe the field schools themselves, which are fun, productive, and educational in many ways, let me spend my remaining time emphasizing our analysis of the paradata generated at sites like them, how and why they serve a strong pedagogical purpose. We find that paradata help fill in the gaps left by human-led data recording practices. Data are context and time-specific in archaeology, such that without a code book or a participant around to answer questions about, quote, why data appear the way they do, end quote, much less explain why certain rules were imposed or routines were enforced among team members. The present user is either left disappointed or hopefully better informed on the question that drove them to the data sets gathered from a dig. We talk about the sense of immediacy that is necessary to generate uniform data, but difficult to capture in never enough scribblings, marginalia, codebooks, asides, and daily logbooks to anticipate the research questions of the future. Finally, we consider the value of teaching non-data archivists the importance of archiving and recording paradata in one way or another, the processes done by people, which is ultimately by valuing and respecting the human experiences that were shared in such collaborative learning spaces as field schools and dig sites. And thanks again. And now over to the next co-author.
Thank you. The next co-author will be about Dylan. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone, and thanks also to the team and for having us. So my chapter is called Paradata for Digitization Processes and Digital Scholarly Editions. And so my chapter talks about Paradata for the digitization of cultural heritage materials. So as you will know, libraries, archives, etc., they're increasingly digitizing their collections and making sure that the digitized versions are available to the public. So, for example, to study the draft of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, we don't have to physically go to the Bodleian, but we can consult the digital collection and look at their scans of the manuscripts online. And as libraries are making that data available, it reaches more people, and it's also increasingly used in new types of research and research outputs. And one such output, one such research field is textual scholarship, and their output is a digital scholarly edition. That's basically where my background is, and also where much of my chapter focuses on. So basically, as textual scholars, we study works with cultural or historical significance and analyze the documents, how they've been transmitted over time, try to glean what that knowledge can tell us about how we can understand the works. So, for example, by studying different variant versions of a medieval manuscript, we can learn who copied what from whom and attempt to move closer to the original text of something like the Canterbury Tales. Or studying the manuscript of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, we can learn more about creative writing process and maybe the extent of which her husband Percy Shelley collaborated, etc. So, and then in a digital scholarly edition, then we take that knowledge and we turn it into a new version, a new edition of the work with variant readings, annotations, commentaries, and now also a lot of the scans of the original documents. But the problem is that when a library or an archive digitized collections are being used by patrons or, for example, by researchers making a digital scholarly edition, they're often taken at face value. And so while digitization is a complex process with a lot of different people involved at a lot of different levels, and they all have different stakes in the preservation of the original, the production of the copy, etc. And so they need to negotiate how the physical documents and their digital reproductions are handled, what kind of equipment is available or relevant in this case, all of which affects the quality of the digitized product. And so my chapter basically starts from the hypothesis that if we had better paradata about these digitization processes, data about the different steps involved and how they influence the final product, we could approach them more critically and improve the accountability of our work. And so to illustrate some of the ways in which the digitization process may affect the reproduction, my chapter discusses a case study where a researcher that I interviewed commissioned the digitization of a collection of manuscripts held at various memory institutions across Sweden. And by zooming in on how quality standards were negotiated between the researchers and library staff in this specific digitization project and the kind of problems that they needed to resolve along the way, the chapter tries to examine which types of paradata could be useful to contextualize those processes and offer some suggestions in my conclusions, both for the digitizers and for the scholarly editors who are reusing those digitized materials. So that's what my chapter is about in a nutshell. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And now then it's Michael's turn. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Our chapter is on Paradata and emergency services communication systems. So emergency services communication systems, say ESCS from now on, is the phone number you call when you need a first responder to come to you. 911 in North America, 112 in EU, and other numbers elsewhere. And so these systems are evolving from systems that are mediated as sort of ordinary telephone services to services that are connected to the internet and become internet connected critical infrastructure. And as a result, they are being exposed to greater risk from the point of view of cybersecurity. So this is the motivation for doing things like modeling and simulating these systems in order to understand how they'll respond in when they're under attack or in specific large disasters or whatever. So what our chapter does is to look at the different kinds of data that are generated and the different processes that are involved when we model a system like this and then simulate it. So the original data is generated by the governmental operation of these systems in the real world, and then the iterative process that one goes through when building an abstract model of the system's operation, and then a computer simulation of that model. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that for the more detail in the panel discussion.
Thank you. Then the final chapter presentation will be made by James Hodge. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's great to be a part of this community. So our chapter, which I co-wrote with Kieran Trace, was focused on Paradata for algorithmic accountability. So we applied an archives perspective on understanding complex algorithmic systems, especially things like large language models and AI training data sets. This was part of an ethical AI initiative at the University of Texas at Austin called Good Systems. So we took software to be the primary manifestation of algorithmic activity that we were concerned with, and we were interested in using Paradata to improve the accountability and the explainability of software as it becomes more complex. For example, when software is using artificial neural networks, things like ChatGPT, the exact functionality is often somewhat mysterious even to experienced users and developers. So we argued that documentation and analysis of the materials and the procedures around LLMs, AI, et cetera, are a particularly effective way to improve explainability and accountability. And those two sort of categories are important because we argue that they map respectively onto diplomatics and knowledge management. So diplomatics maps onto the transparency side and knowledge management maps onto the explainability side. We offer a deeper summary of each in turn in the chapter. So we argue that the application of diplomatics theory from archives works towards transparency. And this assists with things like legal or corporate policy compliance. And it emphasizes how the provenance of data maps onto its history or its biography. We contrast this diplomatics approach with descriptive bibliography. So descriptive bibliography is this extensive cataloging of an object as it is, whereas diplomatics is the extensive cataloging of how it came to be. And moving on from this brief introduction to the role of diplomatics in our chapter, I can now say a little bit about knowledge management, which maps onto less the accountability and more the explainability of AI systems. So knowledge management, we argue, is an approach that can improve trust and decision-making. It uses work products like design documentation or training data sets. And we also make this note that it's not just regulatory or supervisory, it also aids in development. So this is maybe an area where the amount of friendliness we find from developers or corporate management is going to be different in the knowledge management side than it was in the diplomatic side, because better explainability also is useful to developers, not just regulators. So moving from this sort of conceptual area into a more nuts and bolts review of existing approaches, we found there are extant records and examples of some of these approaches in action. So the records that we focused on as having value as Paradata for regulating and managing AI systems are things like policy documents that are produced internally, technical documents produced by developers, records of data used as inputs and outputs during training and testing, and just testing records more broadly. And then we also conclude with some recommendations for adoption of fact sheets or standard documentation formats that are modeled on what we do find in some areas of software industry, things like supplier declarations of conformity. In conclusion, we find and we argue that there is some evidence within the AI development sphere that we see increased need being acknowledged by developers and managers for data curation professionals to collect and manage training and testing data about the process of designing, testing, and deploying these complex algorithmic systems. However, we also note that in the absence of more Paradata becoming available, some amount of accountability can also be achieved retroactively via archival practice. And this is something that we see in common with other historical cases, often when abuse of power is implicated. So I'll leave on that and just say I look forward to the rest of our conversation here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Wonderful. Excellent presentations of the chapters. Now we move to the next phase of this event, and it will be a discussion with and within a panel. Some of the chapter authors, including Rachel, Wout, Sarah, James, and Michael, have volunteered to participate in the discussion of the book and of the chapters. And the first question I have to you all is that kind of, if you kind of think about your own chapter that you have been working on, and then you look at the other chapters, so what kind of reflections do you have on how they relate, how, if there are, you have found any interesting ideas, contrasts, similarities, something in there? Who would like to go first?
If I may, I would jump in.
Go ahead.
Because it's an opportunity for me to reflect a little bit on the role that Kieran Trace played in this chapter and this project. So as a lot of you probably know, she passed away last spring, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank her for bringing me into this project, and I feel as though I'm sort of speaking on both of our behalf at this moment. Kieran was my mentor during a 2-year postdoc at UT Austin, and this does relate to the question that Isto raised. The way that I find this chapter sort of relates to some of the other chapters is it triggered me to think about the relation to forward-looking and backward-looking approaches to Paradata and approaches to library and information science more broadly. So we find that there are both here, and in some cases in the single chapter, we find both sort of outlooks here. But I wanted to take this moment to sort of give Kieran the credit of getting me to think in this method. So I had previously been focused very backward looking. I was using digital forensics to understand the production and the circulation of historical objects. So I was looking at things like floppy disk CD-ROMs. They're so elegant and self-contained and sort of nice and reassuring in a sort of complex and increasingly interrelated world. But nevertheless, I showed up at UT, and Kieran really got me to think in terms of newly emerging data. So we published 2 articles and this chapter on applying archival thinking to our complex algorithmic systems, especially AI, which was supported again by that Good Systems Initiative at UT. And I just wanted to really give Kieran the credit that she deserves, even after she's passed, which is that she got me, and I'm sure a lot of other people, to think about the ways that these approaches we often think of as being backward looking also can be applied looking forwards.
That's an excellent point. Thank you.
Here, and nicely said.
Sarah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say here, and thank you, James. I can say that Kieran was a mentor for me too. She had a tremendous amount of scholarship in the archival science area, and that certainly informs the chapter with Teresa and I. I think we approached archaeological sites in the process of writing our, at least the Pompeii composition together. So we approach that writing process thinking as an archivist and also trying to think collaboratively with the goals of archaeologists. And sometimes they do intersect in really interesting ways. And I think a few of us can probably speak to those moments that we probably had in writing about thinking how our perspectives might have new things to say to other disciplines. So that's something I'm taking away from the connections across chapters, Isto. And then also I might go back to Patrick. When Patrick was talking, he mentioned quite a few intersections that I saw between archaeology, which I know has shaped a lot of the early work around Paradata. I think there's some really interesting contextual questions when we think about the 3D nature of artifacts and items that become excavated from various places and what happens to them afterwards. So I really think that there's tremendous value in hearing across different sets and field sites of practice. So, Patrick?
Great, thank you. Others? Michael, please go ahead.
Yes, so I apologize for maybe not being 100% coherent right now. It's early in the morning for me. So I think that I see that our chapter intersects in a number of different ways with other chapters in terms of that we're looking at different kinds of paradata. There's the paradata associated with the data, in our case, generated by governmental organizations in the operation of a governmental system. So that is paradata generated for someone else's purposes and maybe for multiple of their purposes. But it's necessary for us to understand the system, but it wasn't collected for us. And then there's the paradata associated with us developing a conceptual understanding of the operation of that system and the iterative process it takes of interrogating the paradata, or sometimes the actual human beings are involved with generating it. And then there's the paradata associated with the creation of an artifact, which in our case is a simulation of that system. And that's embodied in two ways when we create software. One is the process we go through in developing the software. And the other is the software itself, which is a process that actually generates simulation results, which is data itself also. And so there was something else I was going to say, but it escapes me.
It'll probably coming back. So say it in a moment. More reflections on the links between the chapters. Okay, then if no, about, please go ahead. No, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I'll unmute myself there. Yeah, just a quick reflections. The stakes are a bit different for my piece than in a context like Michael's, for example, because it's not the lack of paradata is not life-threatening in any way, for example, but it's more to do, in my case, about academic integrity and accountability, etc., where there are also some links to the other chapters, I think. Yeah, so one thing that comes back a lot, and that you also touched on in your introduction, Isto, is the black boxing, and so that is also something that is relevant for in my chapter. But the difference maybe with other chapters, like James's, for example, is that for me it's the black boxing is mostly because of invisible labor that's going on, rather than because of the complexity of the software that's been used and how we track iterations of the software programs, etc. And so, yeah, and one more thing that I noticed was, yeah, unlike what Patrick was saying, So there, in our case, the Paradata is really a very new concept, and so we are probably more in what Patrick was saying, the applying of things rather than the examining and defining of things. So there is, in our case, for the making of these editions, a lot of kind of Paradata avant la lettre, where we have a lot of introductions about what kind of texts we used, from what kind of perspective we studied them, how did we encode them, analyze them, present the results, etc. That's usually part of these editions we make. We don't just present the text, but we also present how we came to analyze the texts. But we haven't actually called it Paradata before. And the thing is, in what my chapter is also about, is that we do that a lot for the texts that we are working with, which are like traditionally are, as textual scholars, our primary source materials, but that now these digital images are also coming into play, and that we are much less thinking about those same types of processes related to those kinds of documents, that we should be trying to approach them critically in a similar manner, basically.
Thank you. Very good point. Okay, then I guess we can move to the next question, and it's the question of the P word, the Paradata itself, and I'm wondering if one or some of the panelists have something to say about the concept and its usefulness and relevance, and whether we should stick to it, and if we should stick to it in what ways, and or whether this would be the final word about Paradata, and we should be turning to some other concepts after this volume.
I'd be happy to say something. So
yes, please go ahead.
So for me, like Paradata was a new word when we started here, and what I really like about it. So my section is about mostly computer code as Paradata, and what I like, it embraces this fact that humans are, well, not machines, and I really enjoy that we can use this term to look across fields, and we can and it fits very nicely to software too, I feel. So I like that we have this term where we can put humans, the person behind writing code or using code behind. So for me, that's relevant because it's very important. It determines if we trust the scientific finding or if it's reproducible. So I'm a big fan of the word and its relevance.
Good, thank you. Anybody else? Yes, I know this is a bit of a kind of a hot potato to comment on, I guess. Michael?
So I want to second that. We, as a computer scientist, I'm used to I was before this used to the idea that you have data and you have metadata, which helps to define the data, but really didn't think too much about the processes. But for example, in looking at, say, records generated in running a ESCS, some aspects of it are probably don't require much in the way of Paradata. There's a record that indicates that a phone call happened came in at a particular time. That's pretty much just like an objective measurement, and it will be similar in any sort of time that we're seeking to model the real world. But then there's other aspects. For example, there'll be some annotation about what was the call about, and I didn't really think in learning more about these systems. You learn that, well, in some locales that might be text that the operator just types in. In other places, it might be text they type in, but it might be from a restricted vocabulary, and they have some process they go through in order to determine what they enter. Other places, it may be something where they select things from a menu system. And so knowing that sort of information has direct implications when you're looking at modeling a system like that, because depending on whether it's a restricted vocabulary or not. That's something that has, well, it's going to determine whether the information that you're looking at is already been pre-filtered, or it's something that you're going to have to work to categorize later. And also, if you're looking at multiple localities, how you would go about harmonizing those together. So that's just one little snippet of how important and eye-opening it was to think in terms of the importance of Paradata in understanding how the system operates as it is, regardless of all the decision processes you need to go through when you're modeling something and you're deciding what are we going to pay attention to and what are we going to purposefully ignore.
Thank you. Really interesting ideas. Okay, then I guess kind of the final question I have before we can move to the Q&A that you might want to reflect upon a little bit, and it would be kind of what next after the chapter in your context of looking into Paradata. Is there something more to look into from let's say this perspective, or as a kind of an outcome of the volume as a whole, maybe, or some afterthoughts? Too difficult question, maybe.
Oh, I have an idea.
Yeah.
So what I notice mostly, so I'm not in academia and like I'm on support of academia, so I'm not a researcher per se on my own, but I do notice that the concept is very useful to me, and I recommend my colleagues that are still in science to like grant up. It gives you a new word, a new fresh thing at things, and putting that in grant applications, probably combined with AI or those kind of things. I feel that's an interesting, fresh angle to do research with. So I see mostly for me pushing others to do more with it because I'm just support at the moment. My paper, I use it a lot, or to as big of a review of the literature. Yeah, but for Paradata, mostly shove it to the scientists.
Thank you. More reflections about the future. I guess there are many different things to explore. Michael?
Okay, so sorry about that, but I've been really thinking about the issues of replicability and reproducibility in science, and this has become a critical problem because because computers. So typically, what is becoming expected is that when you publish, you provide access to data and to the software that, if you develop particular software associated with whatever you published. And I'm still wrapping my mind around how Paradata can help this, but it certainly is the case that, in our lab, we have trouble reusing our own software that we wrote 6 months ago. So it's simply providing the tools that you use to analyze some data or to simulate something is rarely sufficient, and there's an enormous amount of Paradata associated with it that's necessary. And there are famous examples where there have been systemic errors in hundreds, if not thousands, of articles because they all shared a common set of software, and the process information behind how either the operation of the software or the development and the debugging of this software was insufficient, and that software produced the same errors in research result after research result spread across many different users.
That's an important point, definitely. Maybe kind of to the reproducibility and let's say kind of redoing of different processes and practices. So there are in different fields, different types of issues. going to a more kind of qualitative, observational, exploratory research. So there is the problem, even though it's looking very different, and maybe the cues and traces, the paradata that's needed, it looks very different.